My husband and his mother thought my inheritance was already theirs. They were wrong about everything. I found the first lie on a Tuesday morning in March, 8 days after I came back from burying my grandfather. I was standing in the kitchen of the house we'd bought together in Brookline, Massachusetts, a 4-bedroom colonial on a cul-de-sac, 2,200 square feet. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows everyone else's business within 48 hours. Then, Trevor's phone flashed a text from a contact saved as M Real Estate. It said, "Did you tell her about the account yet?" Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community today. I didn't cry when I saw the message. I didn't drop my mug or feel my world collapse. My heart didn't even skip a beat. Instead, I felt a familiar coldness settle behind my eyes, the same clinical focus I used as a certified fraud examiner when I was deep in a forensic audit for the Department of Defense. I set the phone back, exactly as Trevor liked it, angled slightly toward the nightstand. I went back to the stove and flipped the eggs. I didn't ask myself who Monica was. I didn't need to. In my professional life, when a line item doesn't make sense, you don't ask it for an explanation. You find the paper trail it left behind. For 11 months, I had been living in a state of high-level cognitive dissonance. In the world of internal auditing, we are trained to identify outliers. Trevor had become a massive one. The late nights that didn't match the hedge fund's activity, the new phone password, the way he started keeping his laptop bag zipped shut and hidden in the closet. Most people would call it trusting your gut, but I viewed it as a shifting data set. I didn't act on the first red flag because a single outlier can be noise. But when the noise becomes a rhythmic pattern, it becomes evidence. I had spent nearly a year absorbing their lies because I needed to gather enough data points to ensure my retaliation was statistically absolute. I wasn't being weak, I was being thorough. I thought back to our rehearsal dinner at that pretentious steakhouse in Chestnut Hill. Stephanie, my mother-in-law, had cornered me near the mahogany bar. She had a smile that was all white porcelain and zero warmth. She leaned in, smelling of expensive gin and predatory intent, and told me that a marriage is a partnership. She said, "Olivia, sweetheart, you must remember that now that you're official, what's mine is his, and what's yours is his too." She laughed like it was just a piece of motherly advice, but to me it sounded like the opening terms of a hostile takeover. I didn't push back. I just smiled, sipped my water, and filed her words under high-level risk assessment. 3 days after the wedding, while Trevor was busy at the office finalizing a fund merger, I wasn't out shopping for new furniture. I was at an estate attorney's office in downtown Boston. I didn't move my grandfather's money into our joint accounts. I quietly moved the entire $2,500,000 into the George Legacy Trust. My grandfather, George, had spent 40 years building that wealth, one calculated bridge design at a time. He taught me that numbers are more reliable than promises, and that the gap between what a person says and what a ledger shows is where the truth actually lives. I realize now that my marriage wasn't a sanctuary. It was a project Trevor and Stephanie were managing. My compassion had been a financial luxury. They'd been overdrafting for 3 years. They were waiting for me to settle into my grief over my grandfather's passing, thinking I would be too distracted to notice their hands in my pockets. They were wrong. Accuracy is not a phase for me. It is my nature. This wasn't going to be a divorce. This was the final liquidation of a very bad investment. The drive to Wellesley is always a quiet countdown of the minutes until I can legally justify leaving. Stephanie's estate is a sprawling masterpiece of red brick and curated hedges, a place designed to look established, unshakable, and aggressively wealthy. Every time I walk through those mahogany doors, the air feels thin, as if the house itself is trying to starve me of oxygen. We sat at a dining table that was far too large for 3 people, surrounded by heavy silver and the faint, cold scent of high-end catering. Trevor was performing stress today. He had his sleeves rolled up and was picking at his food with a rhythmic, distracted energy that he clearly thought looked like the weight of the world. A year ago, I would have reached across the table and taken his hand. Today, I just watched him through the lens of a forensic auditor. I saw the way he glanced at his mother for a cue, a micro gesture of submission that I had documented 41 times before. He set down his fork, the silver clinking against the porcelain with a sharp, intentional sound. "Liv, I'm in a bit of a corner," he began. He launched into a story about a temporary liquidity crisis at the hedge fund. He used a lot of expensive words: unforeseen volatility, capital calls, and asset exposure. It was a word salad, designed to make me feel confused enough to just trust him. Then, he dropped the line he'd been rehearsing. "I need a bridge loan of $500,000 from your inheritance to stabilize the position until the quarter ends." Stephanie didn't even look up from her wine glass. She just dabbed her lips with a linen napkin and said, "It's really a matter of family legacy, Olivia. Trevor has worked so hard to build his reputation. Surely you wouldn't let it all evaporate just because you're holding on to money your grandfather intended for your family's security?" I sat there and I realized I was witnessing what psychologists call the trap of normalizing cruelty. In Stephanie's world, family isn't a circle of love, it's a revenue stream. People like her view their relatives as capital to be harvested. They don't see their demands as exploitative because they've spent decades normalizing the idea that everyone exists solely to serve the project of the family image. To them, my boundary wasn't a right, it was a betrayal of a contract I never signed. They had normalized the idea that my grandfather's 40 years of labor belonged to them the moment I said I do. I didn't say no. In a criminal investigation, you never cut off the suspect while they're still talking. I just took a slow sip of water and looked Trevor directly in the eyes. "That's a significant amount, Trevor. I'll need to see the fund's full performance metrics and a formal bridge loan agreement before I can even consider it." The silence that followed was heavy. Trevor's jaw tightened another data point. Stephanie's practiced warmth finally slipped, her eyes turning into cold, hard glass. "You're being incredibly clinical about your own husband's career, Olivia," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Some women just don't know how to be supportive." I didn't flinch. I just smiled and went back to my meal. I knew then that they weren't just hunting for money. They were testing the lock, and they had no idea I'd already changed the combination. I sat in a high-rise office in Boston's financial district, the kind of space where the floor-to-ceiling glass makes the city look like a map you're about to redraw. Marcus Webb sat across from me, his presence as sharp and tailored as his pinstripe suit. Beside him was Diane Kowalski, a forensic accountant who had spent 22 years finding money that people thought was invisible. I didn't arrive with a box of tissues or a story of heartbreak. I didn't need a shoulder to cry on. I arrived with my laptop and a digital folder titled Maintenance Log. 41 entries, Marcus murmured, scanning the list of Trevor's late nights, unexplained password changes, and the exact coordinates of his supposed client dinners in neighborhoods where he held no commercial assets. "You've been very thorough, Olivia." I told him that in my world, accuracy isn't a choice, it's a requirement. Using the same analytical framework and custom scripts I had perfected during my years at the Department of Defense, we bypassed his basic encryption in hours, not weeks. I wasn't there to vent, I was there to perform a professional audit on a failing partnership. Diane had already started digging into the preliminary discovery doc. Who of the silence in the room was only broken by the soft click of her mouse and the distant, muffled hum of city traffic 14 stories below. The air smelled of expensive paper and cold, hard reality. Then she paused. She turned her monitor toward me, and the ledger of my marriage began to shift from a story of trust into a cold liability statement. "He's been busy," Diane said, her voice clinical and detached. Trevor had opened a secret home equity line of credit, HELOC, exploiting a signature loophole on our original mortgage to use our Brookline home as collateral. He had drawn $75,000 from it in the last 8 months alone. He thought his request for a tax extension would buy him enough time to cover his tracks before I saw the year-end liabilities on our joint filing. That money hadn't gone to hedge fund operations or his imaginary liquidity issues. It had been used to pay the lease on a luxury penthouse in the Seaport District, the very neighborhood where Monica, his M real estate contact, lived and worked. I looked at the transaction history. Every monthly payment for that penthouse was a direct withdrawal from our shared future. My grandfather had always told me that you can learn everything you need to know about a man by where he puts his capital when he thinks no one is looking. Trevor had been investing in a secondary life while asking me for a bridge loan to save his first one. He was trying to double dip into my grandfather's legacy while actively burning down our house. But that wasn't the end of the data set. Diane pulled up a series of encrypted transfers that had been routed through a shell company. Trevor had established a secret cryptocurrency wallet, systematically moving funds out of his firm's operating account. The current value was $210,000. "He was building an exit ramp," Marcus observed, leaning back in his chair. "He wasn't just waiting for your inheritance to drop. He was already liquidating the current estate to make sure he landed on his feet while leaving you with the debt." I didn't feel a sting of betrayal. I felt the satisfaction of a confirmed hypothesis. For months, Trevor and Stephanie had tried to make me feel like I was the one who was unstable. Now, I had the data to prove his version of family was just a subscription service I had been footing the bill for. My compassion had reached its overdraft limit. "I want the subpoenas served by Friday," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I want his firm's records, his personal Chase account, and the full history of that crypto wallet." Inside me, the anger wasn't a fire anymore. It was a balance sheet. And Trevor Calloway was about to find out that when you try to audit an auditor, you always lose. 3 weeks into the discovery process, Diane Kowalski called me back to her office. The atmosphere had changed. The air felt charged, and the clinical detachment in Diane's eyes had been replaced by the sharp, hungry look of a hunter who had finally located the kill shot. She didn't say a word as she slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside was a copy of an authorization form sent to the trustees of the George Legacy Trust. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be mine. It looked like mine at a glance, the same slight tilt to the letters, the same sharp finish on the last vowel. But it wasn't mine. Diane pointed to a specific point on the document. "He tried to authorize a full withdrawal of $2,500,000 3 days before the Sunday lunch at Stephanie's," she said. Trevor hadn't been waiting for me to give him a loan. He had already tried to steal the entire inheritance. He had even attempted to bypass a local notary with a forged ID to validate the transfer documents. But he hit a wall he didn't expect. My grandfather George was an engineer who designed bridges to withstand the worst-case scenarios. He knew I was marrying into a world that traded in shadows and projections. He didn't just leave me a trust, he left me a ghost key. Trevor had spent weeks searching my jewelry box and office, never realizing the antique watch I wore on my wrist every single day was more than an heirloom. It was the vault's only key. The trust required a physical code generated by a hardware token using an encrypted algorithm hidden deep within the mechanical gears of the antique watch he had left me. Without that mechanical sequence, no signature, real or forged, could move a single cent. Trevor and Stephanie had been hunting for a vault they could never open. He hadn't just betrayed our marriage, he had committed a felony. But as I looked further into the data Diane had pulled from Trevor's firm, the betrayal shifted from personal to federal. Monica Devers, the woman saved as M Real Estate, wasn't just a mistress or a realtor. The audit of the firm's internal communications showed a massive volume of outgoing data packets to her private server. "She's a conduit," Diane explained, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Trevor has been harvesting sensitive client data from his hedge fund, social security numbers, bank routing info, internal investment strategies, and selling it to a competitor through Monica. He was using the luxury penthouse I was helping to fund as a staging ground for a corporate espionage operation. He wasn't just a bad husband with a liquidity crisis. He was a criminal, selling out the very people who trusted him with their wealth. He had calculated that my grandfather's inheritance would provide him with the ultimate safety net once the Department of Justice eventually came knocking. I looked at the forged signature again. I didn't feel the heat of anger. I felt the cold, rhythmic satisfaction of an auditor who has balanced the books and found the theft. Trevor thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess. He didn't realize that I had spent the last year documenting every square he stood on. "Take this to Marcus," I said, sliding the folder back to Diane. "I want a substantive response ready for the mediation. We aren't just filing for divorce anymore. We are providing a ledger of every crime he's committed against me and the law." I walked out of the office and into the cool Boston air. For 3 years, I had made myself smaller to fit into Trevor's curated life. I had accepted the gaslighting and the management of my perceptions. But Trevor Calloway had forgotten one fundamental rule of data. Information doesn't have feelings, and it doesn't offer second chances. He had written his own ending. I was just making sure the math was correct. The mediation took place on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Boston. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows looking north toward the Charles River and the Back Bay skyline, though from this height, the city just looked like a grid of assets and liabilities. Trevor arrived with his attorney, Carl Benson, wearing a suit that was clearly meant to project a confidence he no longer possessed. He didn't look at me directly, he couldn't. I sat across from him, very still, watching the effort he put into his performance of composure. Renee Forsythe, a mediator with 30 years of experience in high-stakes efficiency, opened the session by reading the discovery summary into the record. For 40 minutes, the only sound in the room was the clinical recitation of Trevor's betrayals. Marcus had organized the documentation into 6 undeniable categories. Category 1, the luxury penthouse in the Seaport District, funded by $78,000 of marital assets. Category 2, the undisclosed Chase account, with $167,000 in transfers. Trevor shifted in his chair as the numbers piled up. I watched the specific tightness around his jaw as Marcus moved to Category 3, the secret brokerage account valued at $94,000. Then came Category 4, the personal expenditures on business cards, totaling $31,000. Category 5 was the Range Rover Sport, and Category 6 was the systematic cash withdrawals of over $40,000. But the air in the room truly curdled when Marcus produced the 47-page forensic report detailing the corporate espionage. Trevor's arrogance didn't just crack, it evaporated. The evidence of him selling client data through Monica was laid out in black and white. It wasn't just a divorce anymore. It was a roadmap for a federal indictment. Trevor looked like a man who had spent 8 weeks realizing he had comprehensively misread the person he shared a bed with. Renee Forsythe looked at Trevor directly for the first time. Her voice was as cold as the data on the table. "Mr. Calloway, your counsel has had 4 weeks to review this documentation. Do you have a substantive response to any of the 6 categories?" Trevor looked at his lawyer, then at the floor. He said, "No." He said it quietly, without defiance. He said it with the specific silence of a man who has finally run out of room to lie. I sat very still across the table from him. I didn't need to add a single word. Everything that needed to be said was in that forensic report. For 3 years, he and Stephanie had treated me like a project to be managed and an inheritance to be harvested. They thought my precision was a quirk, something they could use to their advantage. They never realized that I had spent the last year building a prison made of numbers around them. Trevor wasn't just losing a marriage. He was watching the liquidation of his entire existence. The first morning I woke up in my new apartment in Beacon Hill, I was struck by the quality of the light. It is a 2-bedroom space with high ceilings and wide windows that face east, catching the sunrise over the city in a way that feels like a clean slate. I stood in my kitchen, making coffee, and realized I was no longer managing the temperature of a room or the tension in a conversation. There was an absolute absence of calculation. I was not performing the role of a supportive wife or an unstable observer anymore. I was just a woman standing in a room that required nothing from me but my own presence. The fallout from the mediation was swift and clinical. Once I officially filed the whistleblower report with the authorities, the 47-page forensic audit became an undeniable weapon, and Trevor's world turned to ash. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal investigation into his hedge fund's data handling and internal management practices. He didn't just lose his firm, he lost his professional license. The reputation he had spent 12 years building was gone in a single news cycle. His employees resigned, his clients terminated their contracts, and the firm entered a bankruptcy that no bridge loan could ever stop. The financial accounting was just as precise. The court order was clear. Trevor was required to repay the full $285,000 of dissipated marital assets. That included the $75,000 he had drawn from our joint credit line for the Seaport penthouse and the $210,000 he had hidden in that secret cryptocurrency wallet. Every cent was returned to the estate before the final division. He thought he was building an exit ramp. Instead, he built a debt he will be paying off for a very long time. Stephanie's world contracted in a different way. In Wellesley, social status is a fragile architecture built on the illusion of perfection. When the community learned about her active role in the attempted theft of my grandfather's legacy and the systematic financial abuse, the invitations stopped. The church groups and the garden clubs quietly erased her from their lists. She became exactly what she had once warned me about a woman whose personal drama had made her a social liability. I did not reach out to her. I did not need to. The ledger of our relationship was closed. As for me, I did not just move on. I returned. I contacted the consulting group I had left 3 years ago. Professional competence is a recoverable asset. I re-entered the field of forensic accounting in a senior lead CFE position, earning $23,000 more per year than the day I walked away to manage Trevor's household. I am good at what I do because I understand how money moves and how it tries to hide. But mostly, I am good because I am no longer using that skill to survive my own marriage. I sit on my balcony now, watching the evening settle over Boston. The ring is in a box in the back of a drawer I never open. It is not a monument to a mistake. It is just a piece of metal that no longer has any value in my current life. I am 35 years old, and for the first time, the only voice in the room is my own. I sit by my east-facing window every morning now, letting the sun warm my coffee instead of letting it go cold on a kitchen counter in Brookline. I've come to realize that the most dangerous thing you can do in a toxic relationship is to let someone talk you out of what you've already noticed. We are often told that love should be blind, but in my experience, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to keep your eyes wide open and your records precise. Information is not a feeling. It is a foundation. You do not owe silence to someone who used your trust as a strategy. This is my letter to those of you who have always felt like you are standing at the edge. To those who were labeled as the difficult one or the unstable one simply because you asked questions that didn't have comfortable answers. Maybe you've been treated like a project to be managed or a revenue stream to be harvested. I want you to know that your instincts are not evidence of instability, they are your internal audit system. Reclaiming your worth is a methodical process. It isn't about a loud emotional explosion, it is about the quiet, steady accumulation of facts until the truth becomes a wall they can no longer climb over. You are allowed to be your own sanctuary. You are allowed to take your capital, emotional, financial, and intellectual, and invest it solely in a future where your voice is the only one that matters. Accuracy is not cruelty. It is simply justice taking its natural course. Forgiveness is a luxury you can choose to grant or withhold, but protection is a necessity you must build for yourself. I am 35 years old, and my ledger is finally balanced. If this story found something real in you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who needs the courage to look directly at the data in their own life. The truth always wins if you are brave enough to keep the files. A strong hug from Boston.